Well, to be honest, I have absolutely no idea why I put the rhinoceros on the wall. I really don't. It's just one of those spooky things. I don't know, I thought it would look cool or something. I mean, I can try and rationalize it now, but there was that would just be tarting it up. Really, when I thought of that idea, I had no idea why I wanted to do that, except that I knew it would sort of cause problems. And I mean conceptual problems, hopefully. I mean, in a way, that's sort of what, for me, that's kind of scoring a goal. If you can make an artwork which doesn't solve problems, but it causes problems. And so there's stuff that people really need to deal with in a way that they're not accustomed to. So I can sort of, I can dump a bit of art history on it. It's almost like retrofitting an idea in a way, and I could say that I was sort of interested in Donald Judd's work and a lot of his cantilevered boxes and so on, and that's probably true because I was looking at that work quite closely at the time. But it wasn't a case of me sitting down with a rhinoceros on the table thinking, oh, well, if I just rotate that up at 90 degrees, then that's clearly going to be a blah blah about blah blah of blah blah, because basically I couldn't sleep one night and I thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool to stick a rhinoceros on the wall? It's really that simple. But I wanted to create this hallucination, I think. I wanted people to turn the corner and to go, not only, oh my God, that rhinoceros is standing on the wall, but it's yellow. I think in this particular case, it was just important to make an object that was monumental in size, was kind of like the man on the horse you see out the front of the post office, basically. When the rhinoceros was made, my practice was still very studio-based. I had a section of a warehouse in Fremantle, and that's where everything would get made, and I would do most of the work myself. And over the years, I've sort of realised, this was happening a bit around that time as well, but I began to realise that some people were much better at doing things than I was. So I started subcontracting stuff out. And my work was also all pretty kind of analogue at that point. And I began, probably in about, sort of while I was at art school in the United States, starting to use computer-aided design software, which was a huge kind of revelation for me. So I started incorporating that more into my ideas. And in a way, I was sort of, that's kind of, those sorts of things kind of mark the shift. So in a way, that kind of socialisation of my practice has happened more as well. I was still involved with people in Perth a lot, but probably less, and that's become something that I've sort of has become much more important now. When I was trying to find an art school to go to do a master's, I met a professor at the Royal College of Art in London, and I was talking to him about the program, and he said, "We like to discuss the way that materials speak to us." And so I decided not to go there. But I think that materials are obviously densely loaded. They don't speak to us, but they have associations, and I like to maximise those when I can. Obviously, there's also kind of a trade-off with constructability. So sometimes materials are chosen just for pragmatic reasons, but other times they might reference, say, for example, art history, which is why I choose to use bronze a lot. But sometimes I'll use bronze maybe in a way where it's painted so it doesn't look like bronze, except the underside of it looks like bronze, the sloppy stuff that you're not meant to normally see, So it's a way of making the whole casting process more kind of transparent. I've used plaster a lot, I think because, again, it sort of comes out of the canon of the history of sculpture, really. But recently I used it because I became sort of interested in a lot of algebraic models of surfaces that were built as educational tools in the 19th century. And they've been sort of famously photographed by Man Ray and so on. But they're incredibly beautiful things. Henry Moore apparently was a big fan of them, and the Imperial Science Museum in London has a huge collection, these sort of undulating shapes, which describe very simple kind of algorithms. And they're mostly cast in plaster. So it's sort of material choice is a way of accumulating or adding density to the ideas in the work. Though, you know, it's also a way of making things stand up. That's why that Bugatti is so heavy, because it's a car that's built of car stuff, basically. Well, it's probably important to say that I've always been a big fan of pop art, and you know, like Johns and Warhol are two of my sort of favourite artists ever, and I'm very interested in sort of making things that look like what they are. So I guess you could say that my work is incredibly blunt and literal in a sense, and that it's sort of, in a way, the more literal, the better. But what I like about pop art is that it has a very direct relationship with culture, which it obviously borrows from heavily and also literally. So when I use things like teapots or soccer balls, I guess I have some of those ideas in the back of my head, because it's important for me that people who look at this work are able to instantly realise that it's a soccer ball or a basketball, and obviously incredibly well-known shapes and so on. So I guess that's why I sort of use them. It's sort of like having two clues, really. You've got an object and a title, and the surfaces are all there. You know, it's a direct. It's casting, basically. It's an exact copy of the inside surface of a teapot turned inside out. And if you think about it, you can see what the inside of the spout cup and so on, the dimples in the ceramic where the handle is attached. So, you know, just one of those little things. You know, media today is so kind of saturated with special effects, and you know, the cartoon theory of physics where the Roadrunner does this, that and the other, and things boing and spring all over the place and so on, right? Well, there's kind of a lot of that around, and basically anything can be made to happen on television or on a cinema screen now, seamlessly, right? So I'm sort of interested in the way that what you think might happen happens, and what actually happens, and the sort of the gap or the kind of schism between them. So I just started applying forces to objects to see what would happen, really. I did the soccer ball first, and I chose an event which I thought would be very easy to have quite a visceral response to, which is dropping something out of an aircraft. I took a soccer ball, literally bought one at Kmart, sent it to an engineer, a mechanical engineer, and I said, look, I want you to tell me exactly what this is going to look like after it's fallen out of an aircraft and it's bounced. And he took all sorts of measurements, and he used what's called finite element analysis, which is used a lot in the automotive industry, and basically they can predict the shape of impacts on bumpers and things like that very accurately. So I said, I want the most accurate prediction of what this thing is going to look like at the moment where it's fallen out of the plane, it's hit the ground, it's compressed, it's neither going up nor down, it's at this moment of maximum kinetic energy. So he kind of went to work, and he sent me back some files, emailed back some files of what it looked like, and it didn't really do anything. It was like the most bloody boring sculpture in the world, you know. I was like, I mean, there's like a little dent in the bottom of it. There's not much to look at. So that kind of was a bit of a surprise. And that really is that piece is, that's kind of that's the meat of what that piece is about, really. That difference between what things are and how they appear. Titles are tricky. I tend to prefer to keep them as simple as possible. Occasionally I kind of get a bit wacky. Like I called the balloon Shangri-La for some reason. I might change it back to balloon one day, I don't know. But that title I sort of felt, I think, with that title that I wanted to just complicate it a bit more. And so Shangri-La for me offered a whole range of issues that probably wouldn't have come out in the work otherwise. The story of Shangri-La, of course, is this, James Hilton wrote a novel called Lost Horizon in the 30s, I think, and the story is about a monastery, plane crashes in the Himalayas, people forced to sort of crawl through the snow, find a monastery with these monks who, it turns out, are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. And the people, the plane crash survivors, are given a choice, and their choice is, you can stay with us and live forever, but you must sever all contact with the outside world, or you can leave and become mortal again. And I sort of thought a little bit that maybe sometimes, you know, that's sort of the predicament that is offered to people when they view art. It's sort of like, you're not, I mean, it's a bit sloppy, but that's a good problem in a way as well, I think. That when you look at an artwork in a museum, you almost have to sever yourself for a minute from what's going on everywhere else simultaneously to be able to accept what it is and then rejoin. That there's some sort of gap, and maybe sort of to accept that there's a inverted hot air balloon in the Sydney Opera House. You need to discard everything that you know about the way logic and physics and rationality works in order to apprehend what it actually is for a second, and then you can either stay with that or let it dissolve back into kind of nothing. I don't know. Actually, getting the balloon itself made was incredibly simple, but finding somewhere to put it was like really difficult, because there just aren't volumes that are big enough to accommodate one of those things. And I was originally going to install it in a hotel foyer in New York about 5.5 years ago. The hotel was sort of about 100 metres away from the Twin Towers, and we had it booked to go in there, and then you know, all that stuff happened and the project was cancelled. So it became a sculpture without a home in a way. And then the Biennale came and we tried to work out a venue for it in Sydney, and we just couldn't find the right volume. And then my dealer, you know, the sort of answer was sort of staring us in the face, basically. We was probably sitting downstairs Richard Grayson and I having a coffee, and my dealer had pointed out that the Opera House might be big enough. And it is exactly big enough, really. So there's different types of hardness, if you know what I mean. I mean, you know, when push comes to shove, like making that Bugatti was a bit of a slog, really. And I could have used an extra month or 6, but, you know. About a year ago, I decided that I was going to choose a Grand Prix car. And then it was about sort of 6 months of research, just trying to work out which car, researching different vehicles. I started reading about the Bugatti family and that story. So by sort of January, I was sort of ready to start production. There was 3 months of design work. That all happened in cyberspace. I was in New York, my designer was in Sydney. We'd have video conferences and stuff like that, you know, talk about stuff. So it was drawn up in the computer. Then we started, I started tendering for fabricators in April. We started putting stuff in production in May. All the parts started arriving back in August. We had about a month to put it together. And I've still got a few nuts to stick on it when we finish this. It sort of became clear to me that I had to build up a set of drawings because we needed accurate templates to work from, or at least all the fabricators involved did. And there's a young industrial designer named Seb Adams, who I've been working with for about 3 years now on the manta ray and a few other different projects. Very highly skilled designer and very, very kind of fluent in just about every kind of software program that sort of has currency now. Funnily enough, the Bugatti was designed using a program called Rhino, which is just one of those dumb things. So when I said designing in cyberspace, see, the problem was that I decided to start this project in January, and I decided to move to New York in January, just to make my life more difficult, really. So I had to keep things going in Sydney while I was in New York doing other stuff and trying to find an apartment and so on. Anyway, Seb's great on the old email, and I use email a lot. So we were just to and fro, basically, and I would FedEx back packages. I did a lot of research on eBay, and I've got a collection of Bugatti stuff, so I'd make copies, send them to him. Then we'd sort of do this online video link up, and he has a camera pointed at his desktop, which I can see live on my laptop in New York. So he'd get on the phone and call me, and he'd be like, "Hey James, so with this wheel arch, do you want the radius on that 5 mil or 10 mil? And I'd be looking at it in New York, and I'd say, well, I think we should go with 10 mil for that. He'd go, awesome. And those conversations would sort of happen because of the time difference, and because Seb's a late sleeper. That would usually happen in about midnight, from sort of midnight to 2 in the morning in New York. And Seb would sort of do the work. So that sort of toing and froing would happen over the course of about 2 months until we had a sufficiently resolved design. And then it became much more actual. And then I landed back in Sydney and I started taking drawings to fabricators, and I was like, mate, we've got to get this made really quickly, and so on. So, I mean, for example, the Bugatti, at first glance, is pretty impossible to make, on paper at least, but in a way it's kind of not as well, and that became a case of just working through it systematically and solving all the problems. So in a way it almost works backward. It looks like something that's impossible, but is actually very, very possible to make. It's just difficult. The way it works is like you get an idea, and at that point everything's possible, right? And then it becomes a case of working out whether it is actually realistic to construct it. Well, this sort of 30 degrees was a kind of arbitrary choice, really. I'd tried a few different distortions. The bottom line basically was to take a car and to alter it so that its center of gravity shifted to such an extent that it would actually roll over and collapse. And it was also shifted to the right rather than the left. So you could say, in fact, that it's an object which has shifted so far to the right that it's in fact fallen apart almost. One of the consequences of changing the geometry like that is that all the shapes change, obviously, but in particular circles become ellipses. There's a famous photograph that Henri Latigue took in the first part of the 20th century of a Grand Prix car of about the same vintage, shot from the rear. And because of the design of the camera and the speed of the vehicles and so on, the wheels actually appear to be ellipses in the photograph. And that became an early sort of iconic image of sort of speed and progress and so on. So in a way I was trying to literalize that, but again to make it actual and to kind of achieve it in 3 dimensions. So it's a studio practice that isn't an isolated one. And as I said to someone earlier today, I don't really have a studio, I have an office. I do small stuff at home and I do whatever I can, but it's really becoming more and more that the engine room of my sort of work is basically a travel pass and talking to people, and I just find it, you know, I like people, and it's just great to meet these people and talk, you know, and we talk about our lives and all sorts of different things sometimes, if, you know, if we're getting on well or not. I don't quite know how I got interested in this architecture thing, but at one point I was going to be an architect in the last sort of year of high school because it just seemed like the right thing to do, and then at the last minute I changed and went to art school. So I guess I had a very slight interest in it. But it really came about, Neuschwanstein's was the earlier of those two castle projects. And I really came to that piece not because I was interested in architecture per se, but I was interested in that as a building, and as a building which sits at all these sort of strange intersections of art history and culture. At the same time, I was sort of interested in this idea of, and I guess this sort of comes from the Rhinoceros a bit as well, of sort of making sculpture which is somehow kind of blurry in a way, where you just can't quite see what you're looking at. And I became interested in this idea of making a double exposure, which is the sort of the shift in those buildings. So all those ideas accumulated first, and then I kind of became interested in that particular building, which actually came out of a postcard I found at a flea market, where the offset printing had been misregistered. It was actually Carcassonne in France. So you couldn't really see it. It was a bit blurry and kind of screwed up. And I thought, wow, it'd be fantastic to make that actual. Couldn't do Carcassonne because it wasn't so interesting to me. Started hunting around for other buildings, discovered Ludwig II, Disney Castle, and so on and so forth. A lot of people probably don't realise that castle is a complete pastiche of Gothic castles, right? It was built in the mid-19th century and actually has electricity and plumbing all through it, steel and so on and so forth. And was actually designed by Wagner's set designer. So it's a complete fraud of a building, which was then appropriated by Disney, who are kind of the greatest frauds of all. So it's this really kind of interesting thing, and it does double and shift around and so on. So that became a launching point, I guess, for my interest in architecture. Falkenstein's was just a development of that idea. It's a model that actually has an interior as well as an exterior, so it's a little more complicated to look at. And Falkenstein's was actually an unbuilt castle. Ludwig II had reams and reams of sort of follies that he wanted to build, of course. I went to Bavaria and researched his archive and the Bavarian State Archive, and uncovered all these plans for these buildings and so on, which I copied. Know which they copied, they wouldn't let me anywhere near them, but so that was that's how that happened. And then it just, I sort of thought that for a while the kind of vernacular of architectural models would be interesting to work with. So from there I sort of bounced more into the kind of history of modernism, started researching Mies van der Rohe, Korb and so on and so forth, and that's how that body of work sort of unfolded. Now this is called, well, it's pretty hard to work out a title for this thing. It's sort of a folly more than anything else, really. I decided to call it Fly's Eye Conic Extrusion, I think it's called. It is made of radiata pine, which is the most populous tree in the southern hemisphere now. In the northern hemisphere, there's one patch of original forest left, possibly two patches, about the size of a basketball court. So it's amazing that something can be so endangered in one part of the world, but almost like a weed in another part of the world. Obviously, it's used a lot in construction and so on. But I took the basis for it is, I called it a fly's eye because it's based on a pattern of circles that Buckminster Fuller Invented in the sort of mid-20th century as a construction technique, and the particular version of his sort of geodesic dome system looked pretty much like a fly's eye when it was assembled, hence the name. The location of the circles had been extruded to create almost a false perspective. Stupid as it sounds, it's almost meant to look like a tree explosion or something. Digital modelling of surfaces uses geometry which basically describes the surfaces using thousands of triangles. And normally in a seamless surface like the manta ray, the size of the triangles is almost microscopic. They're invisible. And so it becomes this accumulation of lots of things that allows this kind of seamlessness. So if you were to take a microscope and do a macro version of something, you would see a much coarser triangulation, which is what I applied to the surface of the gorilla skull and the mosquito. And in a way, it's kind of counter to the way that digital modelling normally works. Normally, you want to hide that stuff. So it's almost presenting modelling in the raw. And I'd been thinking about marquetry a lot. I'd wanted to do a project with it. I just wasn't sure how. So really, I kind of just applied. I think it's actually called parquetry. In fact, marquetry is curves and parquetry is straight lines. To those surfaces, I'd been looking a lot at. In fact, there's an amazing room of this. Well, I'm sure there's rooms like this all over Europe and the world, but there's a great room in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is just full-on, densely saturated marquetry and parquetry scenes of various bits and pieces. But they normally, with marquetry and parquetry, you use the different tones of the wood to articulate space, so it creates relief and shadow and so on. And I decided to actually reverse that as well. So in fact, the scattering of the tones of the wood is completely random. And in a way, it works contrary to the form of the object, so it almost becomes like in my mind at least, it becomes like camouflage, if you know what I mean. So it's actually working against the space. They are actually Mobius loops, which is kind of a popular kind of beginner's guide to kind of complicated mathematics. And of course, a Mobius loop is a surface that has no edges, so an ant can traverse both sides of a surface without flipping over and so on and so forth. And a mathematician could describe that much more elegantly than I have, but it's a pretty common sort of thing, right? So I decided to use that as a template for a building. So those models aren't actually a Mobius loop. They're actually thousands of Mobius loops knitted into one another to form a three-dimensional thing. The silly thing about it is that if one of those things was actually constructed, and you've got to remember that these kind of architectural models aren't really architectural models. They're highly speculative, and I actually refer to them as sculptures because they're not buildings that would ever be built. And for me to kind of start making models of buildings that would possibly be built is a whole other sort of avenue of research that I haven't taken on and may never take on. But that's a completely different thing and stands outside my practice at the moment. The tricky thing is if you got into the elevators of the Lakeshore Drive Mobius loop and you went to the top floor, you'd actually arrive at the bottom floor but on the opposite side. So put that in your pipe and smoke it.